Hi, everyone. I'm here to talk about the UAS LiDAR program here at MnDOT. I've talked about our UAS program quite a bit in the past, at least how it's represented within the photogrammetric unit here at DOT. It's the UAS program within DOT has really expanded thanks to a lot of really hard work by Katie Gilmore and her group over at Aeronautics. Offering a lot more depth and breadth of services outside of what we do within the photogrammetric office. This UAS LiDAR program that we have really is a partnership with the Office of Aeronautics. We wouldn't be there without them. They were able to secure the funding. I had my only role here was to figure out what sensor package that we were going to mount on these drones, and then work with Aeronautics and Katie's team. They were going to pick out what was the most appropriate platform to fly them on. So while our office has, I've been with the state over 15 years, I've been working with LiDAR the entire time. We have a lot of experience with LiDAR. This is still relatively new to us. We took purchase of this LiDAR and imaging sensor package in June. So it's a new program. We're seeing a lot of new areas to serve within DOT, along with our traditional areas that we serve. I'll cover some of that as we go on, but I'll start off with just who we are. The photogrammetry and remote sensing office here at DOT. We have 11 employees, 1 student worker, 3 certified photogrammetrists on staff, 2 FAA Part 107 pilots, and we provide really the front end of the construction process. We're flying and delivering mapping, in some cases 10 years in advance of a project, and those mapping products that we are providing are used throughout the design and construction, cut and fill, machine guided paving, planning, scoping, base mapping, which many of you might already be using some of the base mapping products that we have, legal historical products, and more here, 3D modeling and visualization products, or products in support of 3D modeling and visualization. Historically, our work has really been confined to photogrammetric data, planimetric mapping, digital terrain models created in a stereo workspace, and orthomosaics. Not a lot of that changes at this point as we move into more and more LiDAR projects. When I started, our office was pushing out about 80% of the products that we pushed out were photogrammetrically derived. We are at about 80% products out the door being derived now from LiDAR. And that's just a change in technology. There are some efficiencies to be had there. There are some other benefits. And there are also some benefits to a traditional photogrammetric workflow. But at the end of the day, our main products are still the same. It's a planimetric map, still derived off of imagery, mostly. Digital terrain models in the form of a tin that can be incorporated into CAD, and then our ortho-rectified mosaics. What does this, what does this all mean though? We're really here to focus on LiDAR. So I think we have to start at what is LiDAR. Bear with me if this is a little bit redundant. A LiDAR is light detection and ranging. A LiDAR unit, it emits a laser pulse and records that returning energy back from the Earth's surface. But it's really a lot more than that. So it's more than just the laser. You need a global positioning device on there, a GNSS device on there to track the altitude and position of the sensor. And that allows you to figure out where that LiDAR energy reflections are from the ground. So the distance of an object is the speed of light times the time of flight divided by 2. And then the altitude minus the distance that you just created is your ground elevation. But you're also then, after that, are going to need an inertial measuring unit, which is going to measure the tilt of the aircraft, or the sensor in this case, since ours are all tied to the sensor and not the aircraft, as it flies. And you'll have to then correct for those tilts in the roll, pitch, and yaw later on in the post-processing process. And then an onboard computer. There's an onboard computer tied to the sensor, which I'll show later, that is collecting all of the data and recording all of that data from all the various sensors within this package. But how does LiDAR differ from photogrammetric derived point clouds? And sometimes it can be rather difficult to determine whether or not the point cloud data that you're working with is laser data or if it's photogrammetric data. But it is important to note that those two point clouds, while they may look relatively similar, they will not necessarily perform the same in automated feature extraction tasks or automated macros that are now even written into like ArcPro. They might not necessarily derive the same result from the same process. LiDAR is that laser pulse being emitted down, so energy down to the ground. And how that differs from other remote sensing methods, satellites, other imaging methods, is that those are passive systems. Oh, let me go back here. Those are passive systems. So that's taking the energy moving up through the sensor rather than the sensor actively emitting energy. So the LiDAR unit, let me get back here. Okay, so the pulses of light energy are emitted from that LiDAR system. And then when they're reflected off of the Earth's surface, that energy is then returned back to that LiDAR system and recorded. And the distance between the LiDAR system and the Earth's surface is the range. So that's the ranging part of the equation there. So enough about what LiDAR is exactly. Let's see some eye candy. This is some LiDAR collected from our sensor. Essentially, it's just mass points. Once it's been post-processed out, any other derived products are just that, derived. So many folks are probably already utilizing LiDAR data in their day-to-day activities, but not necessarily the point cloud itself, maybe a hillshade model, maybe a DEM, or maybe some other derived products from that LiDAR data. But what is LiDAR data tiered to the DOT, or even more specifically to the photogrammetric office? There is a state holding of LiDAR data already in existence. Some might say, why not just utilize that? It's free. We hear some pretty stark examples of how our data that we collect differs from the existing data. The hillshade there on the left, pretty stark differences between one and the other and what you can actually determine out of there. Some of the building footprints, there's a lot of the fidelity on the landscape is lost at those lower resolutions or less dense data sets. And same with on the right-hand side there, the building footprints, the planar features really stand out in these very dense point clouds. And what that means is that we can use some either macros that we've written in-house or some of the software automated feature extraction things to pull out things like building rooftops, paint striping, ditches, and things like that, and model that in an efficient way. Some of the advantages of LiDAR data and some of the disadvantages as well. There's more processing involved. Typically, more computing power is needed unless you're doing a comparison to a photogrammetric UAS model. Those are very resource intensive, more so than the LiDAR models in most cases. There are less voids. Voids in the data come from areas where traditionally would come from areas where a stereo photogrammetric compiler could not read the ground accurately enough to place points, so they would place a void around it. That would then mean that district survey crews would have to go out and fill those voids manually. Here there are less voids, but there's a caveat with that. Because there are less voids doesn't mean that the data is necessarily good. If you're in a swampy or very dense, high vegetated area, those points might not actually represent the true ground, even though there's not a void there. So there's some things to keep in mind with LiDAR data as far as some of the disadvantages when you're working with data sets that came to you pre-processed. There's less break lines involved in LiDAR data. We can hold more fidelity on the landscape with points versus just a bunch of break lines out on there. So we'll intelligently thin that data down so that we can incorporate it into a CAD model later on. And that's where you're seeing all these red DTM shots. Those are little CAD shots there. And greatly improved accuracies on the hard surfaces. Soft surfaces, you kind of get what you get there. That wherever that light hits is where it's going to record the ground at. So if you have very dense vegetation that's 2 feet tall across an area, you're going to be around 2 feet off from the actual ground in those areas. So just points to keep in mind as you're working with this data in the future. I want to show this slide. This is outside of the DOT work, but just to kind of spark some more interest in how the use of LiDAR data is able to change now that we have very dense point cloud data sets to utilize versus existing data. This slide's comes from Rick Moore over at the DNR. They're doing a lot of work on culvert analysis, automated, semi-automated culvert analysis, and it's pretty clear to see those culverts in this very dense data. This would be 30 points per square meter data. We're typically collecting around 100 points per square meter with our UAS, so it's even denser. But the existing coverage at 1 meter DEM and the 3 meter DEM that are available on the MnTOPO site do not show those culverts in a way that you could reliably extract them in any sort of even a manual way. It's a bit about LiDAR, but how do we get there? What do those workflows look like? How do we get from point cloud to derived product? This is how we do it within the photo unit. On the left-hand side, there are all the processes that we have in place to get us to that raw .las file, or that native LiDAR file that many software packages at this point can consume. Mission planning, it's highly tied to coordinating with the Office of Aeronautics. We need to fly at certain flight heights, at certain speeds. We need to follow the ground terrain while we're flying. We need certain environmental conditions, and then aeronautics, the pilots, are establishing how to fly safely, when we can fly, putting forth any notices that might need to take place, and really handling that end of the process where we are in charge of our sensor and making sure that we're going to get the data that we need. Establishing control and quality checkpoints. We rely heavily on district surveys for those accuracy critical products. We will collect some of our own control and checkpoints on some of the lesser grade products. But again, district surveys helps us out a lot with that and getting those checks. And then flying the mission, we're on site with aeronautics, running the sensor, running all of our GNSS equipment that is then tied to the sensor, and aeronautics is running the airframe and the ground control unit there. All the stuff in green is really proprietary software driven for both the sensor and some point cloud manipulation to get you to a usable LAS file. But one important, maybe the most important key is we do an accuracy assessment towards the end there, at the almost the bottom left there, the accuracy assessment of the point cloud before we even start creating any derived products. We'll colorize the point cloud if needed, and the creation of an orthomosaic at this point is pretty automated. There are manual inputs, and after that, we pretty much just let it run and make any corrections we might need to after the fact. The processes here on the right-hand side are all the processes that we use to, oh, I must be moving really slow. All the processes we use to create those derived products. So we first need to start out by tiling that point cloud. They're way too big for us to consume in any of the software packages that we have as one big piece. So we'll tile that into workable chunks, classify the ground out of it, create any raster products, extract the break lines, thin the point cloud, migrate it to CAD depending on what those final deliverables are. We'll need to transform to usable spatial reference system. We do all our work in state plane, but then it needs to be transformed into UTM, county, something like that. We'll create a TIN if that's necessary. And then on all of the derived products, we will perform a final accuracy assessment. That's where going back to those checkpoints that maybe district surveys or we collected out in the field and assessing that vertical and horizontal accuracy of those products. So that's a pretty top level overview of how you get there. This is the system itself. The drone is an Alta Free Fly, piloted by Aeronautics. Sensor is a GeoCube 640, and sounds on this one. I'm not going to cover the drone and the drone platform, other than to say that it can carry a much bigger payload than we're putting on it, and it does appear to be a little bit bored when it's flying in that very robotic pattern up there. The drone is very safe. It's a cinema. I think traditionally it was used to carry big cinema cameras, maybe do car chase scenes. But to hold our payload, it really works well. It's very stable. It doesn't have a lot of vibration, which is very important when you're collecting LiDAR data. It has pretty good flight times for a big drone. And I'm sure that and many other reasons are the reasons that Aeronautics chose it. But we really needed something that had okay flight times and very low vibration, and then could also handle 3.5 kilogram payload. The sensor itself, we get 5 returns. That's pretty important. Just about a year ago or 2 years ago, about the best you could get was 2 returns. And our pulse rate is very high at 300,000 pulses per second being emitted from the laser. The accuracy of the sensor itself is 2 centimeters RMSE. And it does have 2 cameras on board. This is a unique function of this sensor, that the 2 cameras are not nadir cameras, so they're not pointing straight downward, they're oblique cameras. And because of that oblique angle, we are able to colorize that point cloud in 3D space. So typically how a point cloud is colorized, it's in 2D space, and you would if you colorized it and looked at, say, a single tree, for example, that it would be all green, because the only color information you had of that tree was the leaves from the top down. Here we get color information from the leaves and from the trunk itself. So you get the coloration in the leaves as one color, the trunk is the proper color, or same things with building facades. That can help out in 3D modeling. It really helps out in feature extraction when you're moving through these point clouds in a stereo environment and trying to determine what information belongs to what. It's very helpful. Operating time is over an hour, so it's much longer than the drone operating time. So there's been no issues there. So how do we go from LiDAR to usable data? We start out with very big point clouds, anywhere from 80 to 150 pulses per square meter. We need to create mosaics and a plan. That's all based on imagery. Although these point clouds are extremely dense, there is some RGB information tied to them, and you could make a mosaic from the point cloud itself. However, it wouldn't have quite the resolution. We need to classify those point clouds to bare earth. We need to key point those point clouds into a less dense point cloud that's actually consumable downstream. Break lines really help us do that. We can eliminate a lot of points on those very flat surfaces by incorporating break lines. We drape those to the point cloud. I'll kind of run through this process. Kind of a high level overview of it, classifying the point cloud. There's some automated point cloud classification options out there in Arc Pro at this point. They do an okay job, but there is a lot of manual cleanup for the kind of accuracies that we are trying to hold to and for the kind of products that we're trying to produce. So we will start with some in-house developed macros, and start with, even in some cases, some of the Arc Pro tools, if they apply to the process, and then we will go in and do a lot of manual cleanup of that point cloud to get down to a ground model so we can start the rest of the processing. Like I said, we need to extract break lines. Break lines really help eliminate a lot of the points on this flat surfaces. We use a number of different methods to do this. The first two images, you could see the points. There's a cross section taken in the middle. We can see those cross sections. We can start to cut cross sections, say every 5 feet down the roadway, or work with or work in a stereo environment and look at the data in a 3D environment and start laying those break lines down at natural breaks in the terrain. We can also use a process by looking at those point clouds from an intensity standpoint. There's an intensity number tied to each laser pulse, and we can extract information based off of that intensity. So we have some automated macros that will run down a paint stripe, for say, and follow that paint stripe and give you a vertice every foot, or every 6 inches, or every 5 feet, whatever you determine you need in that case. We can write in there skips on the paint striping skips. For crown of road, we typically capture crown of road as the striping, not necessarily the seam line. But then where that sort of information isn't available, we'll use cross sections and other means of determining where those break lines need to be. We need to thin that point cloud down. See, the point cloud is extremely dense. Can't take it into any of most software packages downstream, can't incorporate that in. So we'll filter that down. We do not use a grid filter. We filter down based on height and proximity models to try to retain the most important information possible while not keeping a lot of redundant information. So areas with a lot of undulation in the terrain will have more points. Areas that are flatter will have less points. And that's really, we found that's a far better way to model the ground, as opposed to just keeping a point every 10 feet or something like that, because then you're interpolating in between each of those points. There could be bumps in the terrain that get missed in a model if you go that route. We then need to migrate to CAD for most of our products. And that means turning those break lines and those points all into CAD line features. This is pretty straightforward. This isn't really that much different from processes we've had in place for many, many years. And then I'll end up here with some eye candy, just a few highlighted projects that happened over the summer. This was for Cultural Resources Unit. This is near Ottertail Lake. Very dense point cloud, delivered a bare earth model, or a classified point cloud that they could then use for analysis. Much higher fidelity than the existing state data. So much easier to see, hopefully much easier for them to find features on the landscape that they're looking for. An improved way to look at or determine snow fencing. This is down 94, all the way from, oh boy, Thief River Falls. I can't remember, but a ways down, all the way down to Alexandria, down 94, various sites for possible snow fencing. The way they would traditionally look at these sites is they'd actually go out in the field and walk down the site. This eliminates MnDOT employees being on the roadway and being in traffic and being in danger. We're able to set up typically down a farm access road, fly the drone, and then deliver these point clouds. They're able to sit in the office and set it up where they can step down the data and create a cross section, say every 50 feet. They can measure out their 75 feet from the edge of the roadway, and they can figure out where that terrain is, the elevation of that terrain, and where they need to place that fence, and do that all from the office, from the safety of their cube. Last one I'll show here, this is a MnRoad study. This was for hydraulic design out on the MnRoad site. I thought this was a video. This was the very first project we flew with the new sensor. You can see it's full leaf on. We did not, unfortunately, we missed our spring flying season, which is our main flying season. By the time that we did finally take purchase of the unit, but next spring we'll be able to highlight a number of different projects that are more traditional. I've only got a couple of minutes here left, and I'd just like to end outside of MnDOT's LiDAR and just real quick talk about LiDAR in the bigger picture from the state of Minnesota. Currently serving on the GAX 3D Geomatics team, and doing our best to partner to bring updated new high density LiDAR across the state. This is in conjunction with 3DEP and USGS program. And the map here shows Rainy Lake, Lake Superior, Goodhue County all have been collected and are in review by USGS. Pine County data is already available. And then a few other counties are anticipated, and we just submitted about 3 weeks ago for upper Mississippi and Central Mississippi River region. So hoping to get funding for that from USGS and collect those areas this spring, or spring 2022. And I'm just about at time.